Austin Eubanks was a 17-year-old student at Columbine High School when two of his classmates opened fire in 1999, wounding him and killing 13. He is now the chief operating officer at Foundry Treatment Center, an addiction recovery facility out in Colorado. Nicole Hockley's son Dylan was among the 20 children killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut in December of 2012. She co-founded Sandy Hook Promise, a group working to protect children from gun violence. Andy Parker's daughter Allison was a reporter for CBS affiliate WDBJ in Roanoke, Virginia, when she was shot and killed during a live broadcast in 2015. Andy's now an activist, and he helped start For Allison, an educational foundation named after his daughter. And Michelle Gay lost her daughter, Josephine, in the Sandy Hook massacre. A former teacher, she co-founded Safe and Sound Schools following her daughter's death. And joining us now is John Mina from Orlando. He is the chief of police for the Orlando Police Department, a job he held back in June 2016 when a gunman entered Pulse nightclub and killed 49 people. Nicole, I want to start with you. After Sandy Hook, people said this has to be different. This was an attack on children. People now are saying that about Parkland. It feels different. Politically, do you think it is?
I do feel the difference because I think there's a difference between adults advocating for their children versus children advocating for themselves. And these are articulate teenagers sharing their experience and demanding that the adults listen to them. So I think the politicians need to stop their nonsense fighting and instead, just kind of shut up and listen a little bit to these kids and listen to what they're demanding, because this can't continue. We can't keep letting our kids die and feel unsafe in their schools. And
you met with a number of these activists in Florida.
I did meet with some of them, and their energy and their drive, that energized me. Because I've been in this fight for 5 years. They're at the start of a very long journey, but they have tools in terms of social media and stuff that I didn't really have at my fingertips. They are organizing and mobilizing at an incredibly rapid rate, and they're not listening to what other people are telling them to say. They're speaking for themselves. They're being authentic, and I think that has power.
Michelle, do you see the student activism in the same way?
I do, and interestingly enough, in the school safety space, when we founded Safe and Sound Schools in the spring following the tragedy, the first and probably most powerful group that we were hearing from was students. So we've been working with students now for 5 years. We just released a youth council program that came out this fall. So we're grateful that a lot of those councils were already established prior to this tragedy, and that the kids have this platform to speak in their communities. But I would agree with Nicole. It is different this time because they are organized, because they are speaking up, and we want to hear what they have to say.
Andy, after your daughter's death, you became politically active, so did Allison's fiance. Where do you think that this activism should be focused? Is it at the local and state level, or is it here in Washington?
Margaret, it has to be all of the above. And we have to give law enforcement the tools that they need to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening. And one of them, ironically, Marco Rubio brought it up in the town hall last week, is a gun violence restraining order. And what a lot of people don't know is that with all the alarms and the red flags and the warnings about this shooter in Florida, he was never arrested for anything. So legally, law enforcement can't go in and remove weapons. And with the GVRO, the gun violence restraining order, they can. I hope that this changes the equation, because Barbara and I testified in front of a Virginia Senate committee on this very issue. The chairman of the committee looked at me and said, "We're sorry for your loss," and then they voted it down on party lines. Same thing with a young woman who survived the Las Vegas shooting, was in tears saying, "Please ban bump stocks." They did the same thing to her. So at this point, the Republican Party, hopefully there'll be a change there, but they're the party of the NRA. I mean, that's just the fact.
Austin, what you lived through happened in the middle of an assault weapons ban, despite it. So when you hear these activists, these student activists in particular, call for a ban on specifically that, does that speak to you in any way? Do you say that's misguided, or how do you think this should be focused?
Well, it definitely speaks to me, and I'm really inspired by the level of activism that I have seen. The problem that I have is I think that we get so laser focused on either one of two sides. It's either gun control or mental health, and then nothing ever gets done. So I think that we do have a problem with accessibility to these weapons, but specifically I think we have a problem to accessibility to high-capacity magazines. We have to bring down the number of shots that somebody can fire before reloading, and I think that's exceptionally important. Beyond that, we have to look at why this issue is occurring, and we have to go all the way back to the way that we're educating and socializing young men. And so what I really advocate for is appointing a nonpartisan group of experts who can study this issue comprehensively, and in the near term, we have to bring down the loss of life, and by doing that, we can eliminate high-capacity magazines and assault weapons.
At the federal or the local level?
I believe at the federal level.
You do. Chief Mina, I want to come to you quickly before we go to a commercial break and then continue our conversation on the other side of it. But Chief, it sounds like there were just so many red flags, at least 23 calls to local authorities, flags raised to the FBI, in this case in Parkland. How hard is it to actually intervene as law enforcement? I mean, is this a matter of just local bureaucracy run amok, or is it a failure, a dereliction of duty? How do people understand this?
Well, it's definitely a failure of all the systems involved. You know, at the Orlando Police Department, I know many other law enforcement agencies in Central Florida and across the nation, there are protocols in place for when we receive social media threats, for when we get some of these red flags. And I would tell you that, you know, we don't stop working until that threat is mitigated, until we get, you know, identify the person who made the threat, go talk to them, talk to their parents, and go really hands-on with them. And in many cases, either arrest or commit that person for an involuntary mental examination. The issue and some of the problems with that is even if we commit someone under the Baker Act for a mental evaluation, they can, you know, get their evaluation and probably be released in less than 72 hours and then still go and able to buy a firearm. So that loophole needs to be closed, because many of our law enforcement throughout the country have had many success stories as far as mitigating some of these threats and seeing the red flags and working it till the very end, putting the person in custody or getting them evaluated, and then, you know, and then that person still being able to purchase a firearm.
Chief, we want to talk to you again on the other side of this break, along with the rest of our panel, so stay with us, please. We'll be back in just a moment. We are back with our panel on gun violence. I want to go to Orlando and bring in Chief Mina, who was chief in that city during the Pulse nightclub attack, which did involve the shooter using a semi-automatic weapon. Chief, I want to ask you, this proposal to, at the state level, have skilled teachers be armed. To you, does that make a difference?
No, I don't think that's a good idea. Our teachers already have many responsibilities. It's their job to educate our students, and they do a great job of that. Our teachers aren't trained physically or mentally prepared to handle firearms in a stressful situation. You know, law enforcement throughout the country, not only do they go through you know, hours and months and weeks of training, but they're also carry firearms every day and deal and use their firearms, and sometimes in stressful situations. And you know, for a teacher to be educating students 1 second and then be responsible for responding in a high-stress situation with a firearm with not enough training or mental preparation, I don't think is a good fit. I'm definitely against that.
Michelle, you're a former teacher. What do you think about arming educators?
I would agree completely. I understand that it's a community-based decision, and that will always be our position at Safe and Sound Schools. We know that different communities are made up of different people with different backgrounds, and there are different circumstances. Some of our school communities are facing, you know, response times that may be up to 50 minutes. So I understand this need to look at all solutions, put them all on the table. But when I think very practically about myself sitting in a second grade classroom on the floor, crisscross applesauce with my students teaching reading, the last thing I would be ready for in the split second that it might happen is having to pull out a firearm, pull it from my hip, and intervene in that way. And further, having worked with school resource officers so closely for the past 5 years, we know the level of training that they undergo. We know the time, the mindset, as the other guest is talking about, just the familiarity of having that firearm with you, and all of that work and consideration that goes into that. That's not something I want to put on a teacher who's already very overburdened, sadly, with a lot of tremendous responsibilities.
Austin, Colorado has explored this. What do you think?
So I'm opposed to it as well, but I do believe that we have to strengthen schools by way of architecture, metal detectors, or perhaps additional security personnel. But I do think that those two functions have to be completely separate. Educators have to focus on education, and security officials need to focus on security.
Nicole, with Sandy Hook Promise, you've been looking at ways to harden the response, at least. What are you looking at and proposing?
Well, I agree that we need to focus on how do we handle imminent danger, such as school security and the infrastructure of our schools. But I do believe that the shift needs to focus more to prevention. How do we help identify people that are at risk of potentially hurting themselves or others? That's what we offer from Sandy Hook Promise. We're in about 7,000 schools at the moment with our free programs and our free anonymous reporting system. This is a way for teachers, educators, students, and parents to say, this is what I'm recognizing and this is what I'm seeing, and then have a system to report it. And to be honest, in terms of arming teachers, it would be better to arm them with this knowledge and the ability to do that to prevent violence before it happens. And if there's federal funding available for these programs versus arming teachers, I would put it towards the programs, or giving teachers more what they need in terms of supplies or books, or arming them with more school counselors as well to help these kids.
Andy, I'm going to ask you, you personally face some backlash for your activism, and something we're seeing now with these students in Florida. Where does that come from?
There are a legion of hoaxers that they've descended on me like locusts. They've done the same thing with the kids in Florida. They call us crisis actors. They say Allison has had plastic surgery and is living in Israel someplace. The level of cruelty is just unimaginable. But it's fueled, all you have to do is look up the street on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's enabled by a president that has unhinged tweets every single day, arming teachers. And so he's enabling this he's helping create this sort of atmosphere that brings upon these people.
What did you think of the president's listening session this week? You were there, Nicole.
It was pathetic, frankly. And then when he comes out with, again, this crazy notion of arming teachers are going to quit before they carry a firearm in class. It was when you have to hold a note card that says, "I hear you." I mean, come on, that's unimpressive to say the least.
Wow. Talking points are something many walk into a room with to get through that, but I appreciate your passion, all of you, and for coming here to share your personal stories. Thank you. We want all of you to come to Washington today for this conversation. We really appreciate all of you being here and all of you watching. We'll be back.